Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today I am finally back to cards, back to this channel, and back to continuing my Elites tier list series. So a couple things have changed. I've officially graduated, and am now looking for a job that's not YouTube. I have a new room, I have a new computer, I now have a double monitor setup, so if you see me looking over here, that's because this is where my recording is. Or my OBS is, I should say. Some things have not changed, and that is how I do these Elite tier list videos. So I'm not going to go through everything. If you want, you can check my previous tier lists, either the previous one I did, the previous updated one I did, or the original series, and I go into a bit more depth on how I do all of these ranks. But the important thing to remember is that this is not a crafting guide. You should not just craft things because they are in S tier, and you should not never play a card because it's in C tier, or anything like that. You should play what you have fun with, and you should craft cards for specific decks you want to play. And those decks might include cards that are lower down on this tier list, and there's cards that might be S tier, but, get nerfed in a week. This is not a crafting guide. Whatever this is absolutely not a crafting guide. If you have specific questions about what cards to craft, maybe join my Discord and we can have a bit more of an in-depth conversation there with myself or others. But anyways, today we are going to be doing the German tier list. We did the British one previously. And this is including all of the updated cards. This is all the cards in reserved and current normal rotation. But let's roll the intro and jump straight into it.
What a performance there by J-King.
J-King, full plot armor.
J-King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J-King is our world champion! J-King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alrighty, first card we have here is Africa Core. And honestly, this one is very difficult to rate. I'm sure I put it up in A tier previously, and that is because previously Germany just had the largest amount of overwhelmingly powerful elite units and the most consistently strong elite units. You played Africa Core and you were basically guaranteed a strong, powerful, potentially game-changing unit. And even if it was not the specific one you want, obviously sometimes you want to roll for a Leopold, it was usually good enough. You'd get Jägerbomber, maybe you find a Heinkel, which lets you draw into the Leopold. You find a Comet in case you build one, or you don't run one, or maybe you have two Comets. There was a lot of really great cards you could get off of Africa Core. And since then, they have implemented a lot of really bad cards. So, it's hard to say. I think it's definitely out of A tier. This is Africa Core. You can no longer say it's an A tier card. There's just too much garbage. It's too easy to hit an absolutely dead card. And we've certainly seen that in its play rate, although to be fair, part of that is just German control decks have seen a lot less play. It's still better than a lot of other cards. So, for example, this is still infinitely better than A Few Good Men. A Few Good Men is terrible. Give you a sneak preview to the US tier list. That card is bad. But Africa Core, is it good or is it situational? I think I'd still leave it in good. Maybe we'll put it lower down in the list for good. But B tier, I think, is still the place for Africa Core. It still has a spot in a lot of German decks because Germany doesn't have great ways of achieving value. Now you have some really stupid ways of achieving value, like just running King Tiger and Tiger 1E and the Tiger, the 1Js, is it? And yeah, it's like you can run a lot of big units in Germany. But Africa Core is better than just running a big unit because most of the time you'd actually rather a smaller unit that has at least decent tempo. And if you don't get a smaller unit that's decent tempo, you can just pick one of the big things and then, you're running a crappy big thing with the chance of being something better rather than just running a crappy big thing. So Africa Core, it still has a spot. Just German control decks, German value decks are not really the place to be at the moment. So next up, we have Autocannon. Autocannone. And the Autocannon is a stupidly powerful card, and I'm glad that we've all started to appreciate that. For those, a bit of a history lesson, for those who don't remember or weren't playing the game, autocannon used to be a 3-2 unit that would deal 2 damage to the HQ every time you played a unit. So it had 1 less health, but it dealt 1 more damage to the enemy when you triggered the effect. And it got changed to its current version, and when that change happened, a lot of people, and like an overwhelming majority of people, said that autocannon was bad now. Like, this was a nerf, and the card's just kind of unplayable now. And the reason was because people primarily ran autocannon for the HQ burn damage. Like, it was seen as a burn card. So by nerfing the burn effect in half, people were like, oh, this card's bad. You know, it just a 3-3 artillery, it's basically only slightly better than Priest. And Priest, which is the unit that becomes a 3-3 artillery if you control the front line, it's a US artillery, has seen 0 competitive play ever. And people are like, well, it's barely better than Priest, it's a terrible card. And I have always maintained that autocannon is an insane card, because a 3-3 artillery with only upside is an amazing card, because if you play it on turn 3 and your opponent doesn't have an answer, you win the game. And that is still true. You don't really need to trigger the extra effect. Like, this could be a vanilla card and it would still see play in a lot of German decks. And that's just because slamming down a guaranteed 3-3 artillery, it's really, really good on the offense, because if you go in first, you have board control, you slam it down on 3, you win the game. And it's actually also good on defense, because if your opponent's gone first, they have board control, you slam down an autocannon on turn 3, they have to trade into it. And most decks by turn 3 will only have will have tanks and infantry. So that means they are going to be actually trading into the autocannon. It's going to be dealing damage back to them. So it's basically like a 3-cost 3-3 guard, which is not terrible. So yeah, autocannon, crazy card. The question is, does it go into strictly broken? The effect on the card is absolutely not strictly broken. The effect is just fine. Like, you know, if autocannon was a 2-2, it would probably be a terrible card. Maybe situational and weak. But the difference is, it's a 3-3. And this is one of the few elites that really is carried by its just sort of vanilla stats. And a 3-cost 3-3 guaranteed artillery is kind of just strictly broken. Like, if they ever just released a vanilla 3k 3-3 artillery, that would be the most power crept thing in the game, because there's a 3k 3-1 artillery. There's a 3k 3-1 artillery with smokescreen, and that's a special. There's a 4k 3-3 artillery with smokescreen, and then there's the Priest, which is situationally a 3-3 artillery. 3-3 artillery for 3 is just a crazy thing, and the fact that you have upside on top of that, I think I am just going to leave autocannon in strictly broken. So many games are decided by, do you have turn 3 autocannon? If so, your opponent probably surrenders unless they have specific answers like, you know, Aichi, or Audacity on turn 3. But you can just absolutely snowball out a lot of people with an autocannon. Then we have Bismarck, and Bismarck is a fun one. This is a card that, back in the day, I actually have a video going over sort of the first ever OCC, and Bismarck was a common card in that tournament, let's say. I would recommend watching the video. But Bismarck used to be a very powerful card. This was actually a card people complained about and asked to be nerfed. That was a long time ago. Now, everybody looks at Bismarck and says it's an absolute piece of trash. Why would you ever want to run Bismarck? It's 10 credits for 7 damage. Fortifications is 3 credits for 7 HQ defense. You're paying 7 extra credits. It's a 7 tempo loss. But the point that a lot of people miss is Fortification is a card limited to 1 nation, and it's a card that rarely sees play. And if your opponent is playing something like, say, Japan or US, something that struggles to gain HQ defense easily, this is 10 credits, deal about 33, slightly over 33% of their HQ defense. And by turn 10, you can pretty consistently deal 66% of their HQ defense if you're playing any form of aggressive deck. So Bismarck is basically the finishing blow to get across the line. Now, obviously, a lot of decks run HQ defense these days because turns out Bird is pretty good, and a lot of decks have a lot of burst capability. So, you know, it's not a good card. Certainly. It has fallen behind compared to other cards in the game. It has certainly been power crept, but I would not say that the card is terrible. I think it is pretty solidly C tier, situational or weak. And I think that actually situational or weak actually sums up Bismar quite immensely, because in certain situations it's going to be really, really good, and in certain situations it's going to have been power crept immensely by other stuff. I know a lot of people have compared this to things like other damage to the HQ effect cards, things that cost much less. Like, they're much more credit efficient. The credits spent to damage received is much higher. But, you know, this is something where the top end is better. Like, because there's some nations that have limited healing, you wouldn't want Bismarck to be a 10 credits, deal 10 damage. That would be insane. So, like, maybe it can go up to 8 damage. Maybe it can go down to 9 credits. Maybe even 8 credits for 7 damage. But I think Bismarck is pretty close to being a good card. So, you know, let's not get ahead of ourselves and buff the hell out of Bismarck. I've also now realized that I forgot to actually upload the new cards down here. So, one sec. Alrighty, now we actually have all the German elites. But let's talk about Blamin Vos. So this is a card that, it's a 3-credit 2/4 fighter. When the enemy triggers your countermeasure, draw a card. So I think it was intended to be sort of a partial draw engine for a countermeasure themed deck. But the issue is, well, one of the many issues is, first of all, 2/4 is not that big. It is very easy to remove, and Germany has basically no anti-order countermeasures and very few anti-attacking countermeasures. So if your opponent has any units on board or has any removal in hand, Blamin Vos is probably just going to immediately die. And you played a 3-credit 2/4 fighter, which is bad. Which is hilariously bad. Like, at best, maybe you hold up one countermeasure and it draws you a card. You played a 3-cost 2/4 fighter, draw a card. That's fine. And now, the other issue is it's an elite. So, like, even if you try to build your entire deck around this and you're running British cards to protect this, and you're protecting it from attacking, you're protecting it from blitz things, you're protecting it from orders, the issue is it's an elite. So, like, maybe in the 3, 1 in 4 games that you find it relatively early, it can pop off and draw you a ton of cards and be a good draw engine. But the other 75% of the time, you're just going to lose because your deck sucks. And also the issue is the 25% of the time you do get it and it does become a draw engine, you're probably still going to lose because countermeasures are not good. So yeah, Blamin Vos is just a bad card in a not supported archetype that is essentially like synonymous with D tier. Blamin Vos is in desperate need of a buff. Or just a rework. Next we have Envelop, and this is a very fun card. I am a huge fan of Envelop. I think the card's kind of hilarious. And it's a card that I always play around at all costs because it feels so bad to lose to this. So for those who don't know, Envelop is a 3-cost German countermeasure. I almost said an elite countermeasure, but obviously it's an elite tier list. It's a 3-cost countermeasure. When a unit moves into the front line, destroy all units in the front line. So it's similar to Missing, which is a special 2-cost countermeasure. When a unit moves into the front line, destroy it. This is when it moves into the front line, destroy everything. So if they have no units in the front line, obviously it's just a 3-credit Missing. But the idea is they have, 2, 3 units in the front line, and then they push something up, and Envelop destroys all of it. And if you can get that, if it destroys 2 units, it's probably really, really good. The issue with Envelop is it's a 3-credit countermeasure, and the cost on countermeasures is much different to the cost on any other card, because countermeasures have to be hidden, because countermeasures might have to be held up multiple times before it actually triggers. The more expensive, the cost on countermeasures increases exponentially in terms of how difficult it is to use, and in terms of how good it needs to be when it triggers. Now, the effect on Envelop is a very, very powerful trigger if it goes off. And against certain decks, Envelop is basically guaranteed to go off at some point in the game. The issue is it's a card that they can relatively easily play around, because if they have, say, 3 units in the front line and you float 3 credits, they will just not push anything else up into the front line until either you are forced to spend all of your credits or they just kill you with the 3 units. Or they trade out the 3 units and then push a single unit to the front line, and then your envelop turned into a 3 credit missing, but you probably held it up 2 or 3 turns in a row, so it actually turned into a 9 credit missing. The other issue with it is if you hold it up and they don't really have any units in the front line, again, they can just trade out and then push up the smallest thing. It's really easy to play around, but it is an absolute noob stomper. It can blow people out if they're not aware of it, or if they just don't think about it, so it's really, really good on ladder. It drops off immensely in open deck list tournaments because people will play around this like the plague. There is a certain fun element in that if you don't have envelop, you can float 3 credits to stop your opponent from moving anything into the front line. So that's kind of fun if you're doing that in a tournament. But it is a card that has seen play in the past, will likely see play in the future. But it's certainly far from an auto-include in Germany. Maybe if they get Lurking Danger back, which is the 1 credit draw 2 countermeasures. Maybe people will start running envelop again just as an extra countermeasure. To draw off of Lurking Danger, but just on its own, it's really hard to justify a spot in your deck when there's just so many better options Germany has. So, I think I'm going to keep it in B tier, but at a similar level to Africa Core. Maybe a little less than Africa Core. I think Africa Core is a more likely card to be run. Then we have Exploit the Gap. Exploit the Gap is one of the worst cards ever printed in the game. It actually got printed at 7 cost, if I recall correctly, before being reduced to 6. But it's a 6 credit order. If you control the front line, draw 1 of 3 units and reduce its cost to 0. So, and also possibly give it Blitz. I forget if it gives it Blitz or not. But essentially, it's You need the front line, and then you play it, and then you try to get a big unit. But the issue with the Exploit the Gap is you need small units to consistently take the front line. But if you run a lot of small units in your deck, then you're not consistently getting a big unit off of Exploit the Gap. And if you play Exploit the Gap and hit anything that's like, 5 credits or less or so, you're probably pretty sad about it. Like maybe like there's certain 5 credit cards, like a Yag Bomber or something. But, like, you're really aiming for the stuff like Leopold, like Schaal, like a Panther D, a Tiger 1E, that kind of stuff. But the reality is it's just impossible to build a deck around it. And, even if you do properly build the deck around it by limiting yourself to orders and countermeasures for the early game, and then a couple mid-range units to try to take the front line and trigger Exploit the Gap, it's an elite. So you're making your deck actively worse to build around a card you're likely not going to get, and then even if you do get, it's really, really hard to make the Exploit the Gap effect, even if you trigger it on the unit of your choice. It's still just not that good of an effect. Like, it's a pretty mediocre effect that, like, can very easily be overcame with just, like, simple removal pieces. So yeah, Exploit the Gap, probably still the worst card ever printed. Like, people have tried to make it work just because it's so funny. But yeah, Exploit the Gap, absolutely terrible card. Not even a question, it's down in D tier. Then we have the Panzer. Are these Panzer Grenadiers? No. I forget the name of these. Oh, Fallschirmjäger. So, the Parachute Boys. They're a 2-cost 3/2 Blitz Fury Infantry. This has been in the game since the first set. Like, this was one of the basic cards in the game. And for a long time, it was considered to be really, really bad. Because why would you play this when you can play stuff like 35T, you can play tank decks, you can just play tank, like big tank units. It's a very mediocre card. And like for the first like 5 years this was in the game, like nobody played it. And then there was sort of a brief window in the last few months or so where people actually have begun running it, because as it turns out, there's a lot of 1/3 units in the game. Frontline in particular is sort of famous for its 1/3 units that are going to be thrown into the front line. And the Fallschirmjäger gets to trade out 2 units. It can hit a 1/3 unit or just any 1 attack unit, and then 3 damage into something else. So you can do it immediately on like turn 4 and trade out 2 units. You can do it on turn 3 if you have an action, but then also have a credit to push something else to the front line. It can be a situationally great tool, like coming back on the board. And if you're playing against a control deck, you can just, play it, push it to the front line for 3 credits, and if your opponent has an answer to it, they have an answer to it, you played like a 2-drop, and they answered your 2-drop. But if they don't have an answer to it, it can put out so much damage so quickly, or just threaten to put out so much damage so quickly, especially if you're running cards like Blitzkrieg in your deck, that your opponent might be forced to play, like, a very inefficient piece of removal on the Fallschirmjäger, and then you put 3 credits into it. Maybe they put 3, 4, 5 credits into removing it, and also with your best piece of removal, and then you just play, the next biggest thing in your hand, and they no longer have that removal for it. So as it turns out, it's actually, like, a pretty decent card. Like, it's not great. It's not, like, an amazing card. It's very simple. It just says Blitz and Fury on an infantry. But I honestly think that it's probably better than Africa Core and Envelop, just because it's all around easier to run in any deck. And it's more decently strong. Not easy to run in any deck, sorry. It's easy to run against any deck. Like, it's not just going to be stuck in your hand as a dead card. Like, even in, like, the worst possible matchup, you can still play it as a 3 credits, deal 3 damage to something in the front line, or 3 credits, put another unit on the board that your opponent is forced to answer. Like, it's never terrible. Then we have Fast Hinds, and this is a fun one. It is the card that the Hinds archetype is named after, even though it never runs Fast Hinds anymore. And has led to many fun decks like No Hinds Hinds, and then later, No Hinds Hinds Hinds, or Hinds No Hinds Hinds. I forget exactly the name for it, but essentially, Fast Hinds is a card. It's a 1-credit order. Give your German tanks +2/+1 if they are in the front line. And that's exactly it. It just gives your German tanks +2/+1 for 1 credit. It's a buff card that exclusively affects German tanks and exclusively in the front line. So obviously, you try to play it as a deck that runs a lot of German tanks and gets them to the front line, and then this is sort of like a mini Blitzkrieg of sorts. And the reason it has stopped seeing play is because actually in Hinds, you typically want all of your tanks in the support line for as long as possible, because it's harder for your opponent to remove them. And you play a lot of buff cards, like the Panzer III-E, the Panzer III F, and the Panzer III-G. I think I'm getting those right. But anyways, you play a lot of units that essentially buff the health and the attack of your tanks, so you want to keep them in the support line for as long as possible until you are buffing them. And then when you push them to the front line, you just want to play Blitzkrieg because it does more damage, and you buff the attack on your tanks to win the game. Fast Hinds has just sort of fallen out of the meta just because of the way the game is played these days. Usually you just spam units on the board, try to buff their health up, your opponent tries to remove them with big AoEs until you take the front line and win with a big Blitzkrieg. At least that's the way that Hinds plays, because Hinds doesn't really have access to as good staying power for just general mid-range stuff, such as like US Frontline, and it doesn't have like the fast-paced gameplay of something like Jagro. So Fast Hinds has just sort of become awkward. It also received a big nerf. It used to buff them anywhere on the board, and it was incredibly powerful then, because you'd put 4 German tanks in your support line with Smokescreen, and then you'd play like Fast Hinds for the Emperor, push them all to the front line for free, and then play Blitzkrieg and win the game. So yeah, that's Fast Hinds. I would probably put it down in C tier. I think it's actually probably lower on this list for me than Bismarck. It's just very difficult for me to imagine a game where you can consistently get enough German tanks to the front line where you want to play Fast Hinds over attacking, or over playing more units on the board, or over just playing Blitzkrieg, and in situations where playing Fast Hinds is actually going to help you in a situation where Blitzkrieg wouldn't, or Blitzkrieg wouldn't be enough. So yeah, it's down here in C tier. It's not terrible, but it's really not that good. Then we have From the Deep, another elite countermeasure, 2 credits. When the enemy deploys a unit, destroy it. This is just a very straightforward countermeasure. Probably one of the first that people learn to sort of play around. And honestly, it's just really good. I mean, it's run in every single German control deck and plenty of German mid-range decks since the dawn of time. And it's because 2 credits is enough where your opponent can reasonably play around it. It's not insane. If you see Germany float 2 credits, you play the smallest thing in your hand. But it's also easy enough that you are going to consistently float 2 credits because you don't have anything to play over the course of the game. And having a card that is so commonly run and so, like, fundamental to a nation's archetype, that people will play around it no matter what, and that's actually a really good way to bait people into playing more units on the board. If you're Germany, like, if you're Germany and you have a big AoE coming, just float 2 credits, your opponent will play something small, and then play the big thing that they wanted to play. And then you clear the board and hold up from the deep, and then, you know, they don't have that small thing in their hand to walk into from the deep anymore. It's sort of like the Ultra of Germany, in some respects. So, yeah, it's a pretty simple card. We're just going to leave it up in A tier. Not much else to say about it. It's just really good. Also, there's few... Like, obviously, there's a lot of decks that run 1-drops, but the decks that run 1-drops, you are fine killing their 1-drops with From the Deep. And then the decks that don't run 1-drops, or at least don't run a lot of 1-drops, at, like, worst, they play a 2-drop and your From the Deep kills a 2-drop and you've gone credit equivalent. Like, it's so credit efficient for what it does. And also, playing units is so necessary. Like, it's such a simple trigger condition that you're not likely to waste a ton of credits over the course of the game holding up From the Deep. And if you are, it's because your opponent is not playing units, which means that they themselves are also suffering from playing around this. So yeah, From the Deep, just a great card. Then we have Greif. So Greif is a 1-credit, 1/1 tank. With the passive effect, your other tanks operate for 1 less. And this card is absolutely busted. This is better than Autocannon. This is one of the strongest cards in the game in terms of its effect. Obviously, Hinds is not the best deck in the game, so I'm not saying like your Greif needs to be immediately nerfed. I more mean that just Greif as a card limits so much what you can do to Germany, in terms of what cards you can give Germany, because it's such a ludicrously powerful card. So let me explain. Most cards, like Operation Cost, is a core mechanic to the game. It is what stops you from just being able to basically play the game like you might play Hearthstone, where you play units on curve every single turn and also attack them in the face every single turn with the previous units you've played on curve. Because in cards you have Operation Cost, so you play a unit on turn 5, a 5-cost unit on turn 5, and then on turn 6 you have to make a decision between playing a 6-cost unit or attacking or moving with your 5-cost unit and doing something else with your remaining credits. So anything that can reduce Operation Cost is very, very powerful, and specifically reducing it from 1 to 0. Because once you reach 0, you can just, like, free is amazing. Whereas 2 to 1 is less impactful. So, with that in mind, most units in this game have 1 Operation Cost. Like, if a unit has 0 Operation Cost, then it's probably a pretty weak unit to, like, make up for the fact that it has 0 Operation Cost. Whereas 1 is just sort of the default Operation Cost for any cheap unit in the game, and units that have 1 Operation Cost are more likely to get Blitz, because, it might have Blitz, but, it costs a credit or 2 to actually be able to use it, depending on the unit type. So, anything that reduces things from 1 cost to 0, and that unit has Blitz, is suddenly insane, and tanks are actually the best cards to get the most value out of this, because tanks require 2 operations to attack into the support line. So they can move once and then attack once, and unlike infantry, which also require 2 operations to use like that, tanks can do that in the same turn, which means you can easily do stuff, and you've probably seen this before, where you play Greif, and then you play, like, 4 1-cost Blitz tanks. So, that's 5 credits. And what would then originally cost you an additional 8 credits to move and attack with all of those tanks is going to cost 0. So, Greif just immediately gives you 8 free credits worth of tempo. And just the way Hinds is built, with Blitzkrieg being the core win condition, turns out getting tanks to the front line for 0 operation cost is really, really powerful. You can also save it because a lot of these Hinds decks have units with Smokescreen. You keep units in the support line with Smokescreen, and they just chill there, and then you play Greif. They all operate for free with 0 cost because they're already on the board, and then you play the Blitz units after them from your hand, and then they operate for free. Greif is just, like, you can easily just essentially generate, like, 10, 15 credits worth of value off of Greif on, like, turn 5, turn 6. the difference, I'm sure, if you look at the stats of how much Hinds wins, if you look at the win rate in games where you don't draw Greif, it's probably like 45%, 40%. And if you look at the win rates where you do draw Greif within the first 5 turns of the game, the win rate probably goes up to like 75%. Like, there's very few cards in the game that have such a massive impact on whether or not you win the game. And it's not just like a sort of a combo deck where, if you draw your combo pieces, you win. It is an archetype. It's just like Germany aggro. Greif is an insane card, and I cannot say that enough. Then we have Admiral Hipper, and this is a fun card because it's gone through a lot of different, it's, as far as I'm aware, never been changed. But it has gone through a lot of different evaluations over time. So Admiral Hipper is a 5 credit order. You select a unit and send it to its owner's hand, and then the enemy loses a credit slot and does not draw a card on the following turn. Well, actually, more specifically, they do not gain a credit slot, and they do not draw a card on the following turn. So it's actually, I'm pretty sure that's the wording, so it's actually good into self-credit denial, because you're not losing the credit slot, they're just simply not gaining one. But yeah, it's, it can fit into a lot of things. We've seen it run in decks that are trying to deny the opponent credits. We've seen it run in decks that are trying to deny the opponent card draw. And we've just seen it as just a generally good card you can play on turn 5 as just a sort of like a quasi-removal. Like, you just play it on turn 5, you bump the unit back to hand, and you buy yourself a bit more time, a bit more credits to try to answer the unit permanently. And because it doesn't draw them a card, it's not like you're falling super far behind on resources. So it's just an all-around really, really powerful card that fits into a lot of different archetypes. I've even seen it run in aggro decks as a bounce tool to get around guards. It's just a really solid card, but it's also gone through phases where people have cut it. Not because they thought it was bad, but because they thought it was maybe just like, the 41st best card that they could put into a Germany deck. And it's hard to say whether or not that's wrong, because there is certainly situations where you will have Admiral Hipper and it will feel like it will do absolutely nothing. Because it's like 5 credits, remove 1 unit from the board temporarily, but all of your opponent's units have Blitz, they have like 4 units on the board, and, denying them credits or cards isn't going to matter because they're just going to kill you next turn. So there's certainly situations where Admiral Hipper just simply doesn't do anything, compared to, say, a card like Shelling, which will just shut the entire board down for a turn, while denying them credits. So Hipper, I'm not going to put it up into S tier. I think Hipper is a solidly A tier card. And whether it's better or worse than From the Deep, I think it's probably slightly worse than From the Deep. It's a lot easier to think of situations where Admiral Hipper just absolutely wins you a game, and completely shuts the opponent down. But there's also a lot of situations where Admiral Hipper kind of just sits in your hand and does nothing. Whereas From the Deep, even if you never draw it in the game, it will still have an impact on the game, most likely. So yeah, we're going to leave Hipper in A tier. Then we have Jägerbomber. This card got rotated, thankfully. Hopefully it doesn't come back, because this is one of the stupidly strong cards of the game. Jägerbomber is a 5 credit, 5/4 fighter, 2 operation cost, deployment, send an enemy ground unit to its hand. Or to your enemy's hand. So this card is just an absolutely crazily powerful tempo swing, and because it's at 5 cost, it can fit into any deck. Because if you're playing a control deck, there's a lot of ways you can actually use this with synergy. Either you fill their hand with a lot of retreat effects, like Leopold, and then something like Jägerbomber will make them overdraw or destroy the unit outright if they have 9 cards. But it can also be used in decks like Discard or Draw Denial, because you can return a big, scary unit to their hand and then immediately discard it. And you can also play it in any aggro mid-range decks, because it simply removes a guard unit, because all the guard units are ground units. And it will remove a guard unit while developing a very big unit that on the following turn might be able to trade into that guard unit, or be able to push damage to the HQ after you trade it to the unit, or remove the unit with other stuff. So it's essentially like in a lot of ways, it's a better Hipper. Like, it's a similar effect to Hipper as a 5 cost send a unit to hand, but the Jägerbomber comes with a 5/4 body, whereas Hipper doesn't. Now, obviously, Hipper does different things. Like, there are different cards. I'm not just trying to say it's better than Hipper because it comes with the body. Because there's obviously situations you can imagine where Hipper would be better, but most of the time, Jägerbomber is better. And also, you can just play Jägerbomber on an empty board sometimes, because a 5-cost 5/4 fighter is just a scary unit that a lot of decks will struggle to deal with, and it kills your opponent in 4 attacks. So, you know, Jägerbomber, just absolutely stupidly strong card. And it's going into S tier. I think I would... It's hard to compare to Autocannon. I think I would put it above Autocannon, though. Just because Autocannon drops off heavily and how useful it is. Like, if I were rating these on how good they were to have on curve, I would probably say a turn 3 Autocannon is more impactful than a turn 5 Jägerbomber by a little bit. But if you're talking about how good they are on average throughout the entire game, Jägerbomber is never bad, whereas Autocannon can sometimes be somewhat inconsequential drawn later in the game. Then we have another stupidly powerful card. We have the Heinkel. So the Heinkel, of course, I'm sure you've all seen it. It's the 2-cost 1/2 Blitz Bomber. When this unit attacks, add a Spoils of War to your hand. And Spoils of War is the 2-credit order. Choose one of 3 cards from your deck. Draw 1, put the other 2 on the bottom of the deck. So, how good is Heinkel? Because obviously we all know this card is absolutely crazy. It actually came out as a 1/3, and I pushed very hard for this card to be nerfed. I remember a lot of people, like, because this card was very popular in a German Heinz deck, and the German Heinz deck received a bunch of nerfs on its own. So when I was pushing for also nerfing Heinkel, a lot of people were like, well, why would you also nerf Heinkel? Like, the deck is dead. Why do you need to, like, nerf the brand new card that came out? If you're, like, nerfing all the other cards in the deck that it's very popular in. And the very clear reasoning is Heinkel was just a stupidly broken card. Like, it was incredibly powerful in the best of Germany deck at the time, but that's just because it's stupidly powerful in every single Germany deck, and that is true now as a 1/2. So imagine if this was a 1/3. It's so much harder to remove. It's so much easier to stick on the board on turn 3 and snowball out. And the Spoils of War effect is really, really good. It's essentially, like, it's probably a little bit better than if it was just to draw a card. Whenever this attacks, this kind of makes me think of the Fireman. It's a 2-cost 1/2 France Bomber. When this attacks the HQ, draw a card. So it has to attack the HQ, which means you're not getting the value of free damage off the bomber. And also it doesn't have Blitz. It's so much worse than that. So how good is this card? As a 1/2, it's certainly, like, it's a lot harder to get this to stick for more than one turn. And, you know, if it sticks for one turn, then it's not amazing. However, so I don't think I'd put it up into S tier. I think I'd just put it very high A tier. It's not going to single-handedly turn many games around. It will turn some games around by just like an aggro deck can stick it with very few cards in hand, and then they just generate so many Spoils of War. It lets them, like, draw a huge hand again, or lets them fish deep for, like, something like a Comet or a Blitzkrieg to get them across the finishing line. But most of the time, it's just a incredibly powerful card that you play with the knowledge that it will trade 1-for-1 with something. Like, you play it, you kill something, and then your opponent will trade into it or remove it. But the upside is you get a Spoils of War, which is something that you can use to draw into better cards that you need in that matchup. So it's just a really good card. Now let's get to one of my least favorite cards ever printed in Cards, is the King Tiger, a 12-cost 10/10 heavy armor 2. Your entire support line cannot be targeted. Like, all of cards in your support line are cannot be targeted by orders or deployment effects. So this is just, like, the huge card. You know, it costs 12 credits. It's one of the only 12 credit cards in the entire game. And the idea is you just play this, and it's a huge 10/10 heavy armor 2, and when you play it, it is in the support line itself. So it cannot be targeted by deployment effects, it cannot be targeted by orders, so it can't be immediately removed by something like Lion for a Day, or something like that. Or something like a Naval Brigade, or La Decima. And it also makes everything else in your support line immune to orders, so your opponent can't just try to burn you out with orders. It also means that if you play it and you have a guard unit on board, they can't just, like, suppress the guard unit and go face. So it's a very powerful card if you could get it on the board. The issue is it costs 12 credits, and, you know, typically by turn 12, you will have won or lost the game 99% of the time anyways. 99 is a bit of an exaggeration, but if you're playing against any mid-range or aggro deck, by turn 12, you should have won or lost the game as a control deck. And King Tiger is not really going to turn that around, particularly. The other thing is, the reason I don't like this card, but the reason that makes it's very polarizing, is it cannot be targeted, but it can still be hit by non-targeted effects. So, for example, cards like Monsoon Rot, or Defend in Depth, or B-17, or TBF Avenger can hit the King Tiger because none of those are targeted effects. None of them you have to drag and point at the unit, but all of them can be used to destroy King Tiger very, very easily. So it makes King Tiger pretty bad if, like, half the decks in the game, well, maybe not half the decks, but like half the nations in the game are able to essentially immediately remove your 12 credit card for much less than 12 credits the turn you play it. However, there's certain nations in the game, like mainly Soviets, that cannot destroy this unit at all because everything they have is targeted. Now, that has actually changed since this card first came out and first run. Because they now have Depths of Winter, which is a stupid card in its own right, and we'll get to that once we get to the Soviet tier list. But I don't like the design of having a card where you play it against Soviets and you essentially immediately win the game. Whereas if you play it against, like, a US, and we're talking control mirrors here, and you play it against, like, a US control deck, and they remove it for, like, 4 credits and move on with their life. It's just a stupidly polarizing card, and you already had really big can't be targeted by orders cards like the Tiger 1E. So, like, why did you need an even bigger, more polarizing card? Because when this came out, Soviet control, it wasn't, like, the best deck of the game, but, like, Soviet control existed. But for so long after this, German control just dominated Soviet control because German control would just play King Tiger, then you win the game. And sometimes you'd play Africa Core and get a second King Tiger and definitely win the game. And yeah, there was just nothing you could do about it. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit. But that's why I don't like the design of King Tiger. Now, how good is King Tiger? It has only gotten worse as there have been more and more ways of doing non-targeted removal added to the game and added to more and more nations. So yeah, King Tiger has just gotten worse. There's, I guess, slightly more ways to cheat it out early, because that's, it's a 12 credit card, but maybe you can get it before turn 12. Maybe you could exploit the gap into it, but that's not happening. No real decks are doing that. So we're going to put it down into C tier. It's not terrible or not supported, because there are situations where you're playing against a deck like Soviets, where you're just trying to build as heavy a deck as possible to call out specific anti-aggro type decks. Another really great use for King Tiger is it makes your entire support line immune to orders, which means you just play this against push OTK and they lose the game. Because they can't target any of your units with red dons, and even if they can target their own units with red dons, they can't target your HQ with push. So yeah, it's pretty funny. I've lost several games as playing push because my opponent will play Africa Core and get King Tiger and just slam it down on turn 12, the turn before I kill them with OTK, and then I just lose the game. So it has its situations, but alas, those situations so far are few between. So I'd still say it's probably better than Fast Times, but I think it's probably worse than Bismar. Then we get to Comet. And Comet is arguably one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. It is my least favorite card in the entire game. I hate Comet, and I say that as someone who plays a lot of Comet. I love playing Comet, don't get me wrong. I just, hate that this card exists in the game. I think it is really, really terrible for the game that Comet exists as a card, and I've spoken about that at great length, so I'm not going to get into it a ton here, but essentially so for those who don't know, or need a refresher, it's a 6 credit fighter, 0 operation cost, 4/2 blitz. at the end of your turn, return this unit to your hand. So if it doesn't die on the turn you play it, it goes back into your hand and you can play it again in the future and for as many times as you are able to play it, and don't either have it die to a countermeasure or trade it into a unit that will kill it. So essentially, it's 6 credits, deal 4 damage. And if the HQ isn't guarded, you can deal that 4 damage to the HQ, or you can deal that damage to a bomber, you can deal that damage to units with 1 attack, or sometimes, if you need to, you can just trade it out and you do 6 credits, 4 damage to something like a tank or an artillery or a fighter or an infantry or whatever. Now, the reason it is so ludicrously powerful is the fact that you can just target the HQ. Over it, win. Because if your opponent... There are certain nations that will just have absolutely no answer beyond just trying to play guards, and even there are certain nations that don't really have access to guards, like Germany. But at least those nations have access to a handful of countermeasures that maybe you can try to use to stop Comet, like a careless talk, but obviously countermeasures can be played around, and units with guard can simply be removed or suppressed or anything else. So Comet is essentially just a win condition in of itself, and it's a win condition that can work in control decks, where you just play a ton of removal, and then you win with Comet. It can be run in aggro decks, where you run a ton of cheap one-cost blitzers, try to take the front line, win with stuff like Blitzkrieg, but if your opponent clears the board and you've dealt a lot of damage, but not quite 20 damage by, like, turn 6, you just start playing Comet every turn and you win through that. It's obviously great in mid-range decks. It's very easy to combo, because you can buff its attack. It has 0 operation cost already. It's already a 0 operation cost fighter, so, you know, Burst of Fire, Honor, and suddenly you're dealing 18 damage from hand for 10 credits. So it's very easy to OTK with this card. Yeah, Comet, I think, is probably the best card in Germany. And to be clear, again, not a crafting guide. And also, it's the best card in Germany because it warps the entire game around it. Like, when you go to build any deck in the game, you have to stop and think, what do I do against Comet? Now, in some decks, you just say I win before they can get to Comet, or I lose if they play Comet. And that's fine, but if you're playing any type of control deck, any type of slower deck, you have to think to yourself, what do I do when my opponent just plays Comet? What are my answers for it? How do I find these answers? How many guard units do I have if it's just guard and prey? And hope that they can't remove it. And then when you're playing against Germany, you have to keep that in mind as you play, thinking like, how many resources do I have to stop Comet? What are situations I can set up to force them to trade Comet? It literally warps the entire, like, competitive gameplay around one card in a way that very, very few other cards can do. Like, the only ones that really come to mind are cards like Commonwealth. And that's only in specific metas. Whereas Comet is just sort of always present. If there is a Germany, there is going to be Comet. And in a tournament where you have to bring 3 nations, there's often going to be Germany. So yeah, it might not be as, like, singly, like, visually powerful on, like, a single blowout turn as, say, Greif, and it might not have the same you win the game if you draw it effect as Greif. Sort of. And part of that is Greif, you need to draw it within, like, 5 turns, obviously. Whereas Comet is just, like, so consistently powerful, and it's a card that is just, you put it in a 39-card deck, and, you know, you can have 0 synergy with it. It can literally just be a random card you throw in your deck, and it will just mean you will have an 100% chance of winning a fair number of matchups. Like, your win rate against certain matchups will probably go from, like, 20% to, like, 95%. Just immediately because you put 1 card in your deck. And it's a card that is also going to be good into almost every single deck, even if it's not the ones where it's immediately winning. So Comet, stupid card, needs to be... I'm so mad that it hasn't been rotated yet, and I keep, like, convincing myself it's because they might rework it, they might nerf it, something. I've offered several suggestions, but alas, Comet is at least temporarily here to stay. Next up, we have Kriegsmarine. I'm sure many of you haven't seen this card because it was rotated very early, and I don't think it's coming back, and even if it did come back, it didn't see play for a very long time that it was in the game before it was rotated. However, if you go back and watch that aforementioned sort of first ever OCC video that I did with Bear Gardner, Kriegsmarine was sort of the golden child back in the day. So Kriegsmarine is a 7-cost order, deal damage to the enemy HQ equal to the number of cards in their hand, and then discard one of their cards. So, you can use this when they have 1 card in hand to discard the last card in their hand and deal 1 damage, which is pretty bad, but you're discarding the last card in their hand. Or you can do this after forcing them to draw with stuff like Phony War. And then you play Kriegsmarine, and they have 9 cards in hand, and it's 7 credits, deal 9 damage, which suddenly gets a lot better than Bismarck. Or most of the time it's somewhere in between, where, 7 credits, deal 5 damage, deal 6 damage, and also with the added effect of discard a card, maybe it's a board player, maybe it's a guard, maybe it's an HQ game. All in all, it's probably a bit worse than Bismarck, just because a lot of decks will have pretty small hand sizes by the time you get to turn 7, so it's just substantially less consistent. And if you're playing a deck where you're trying to burn down your opponent, you probably do not care about discarding them that much. Like, there's times where maybe you discard the card that was going to win them the game, but most of the time it just does kind of absolutely nothing. So it's substantially worse than Bismarck, and Bismarck's already in C tier. So the question does it go down into very low C tier, or does it go down to D tier? I think low C tier, because Germany, France, burn is sort of an archetype. And you run a lot of forced draw stuff, and then Kriegsmarine has synergy with that, and then you also burn your opponent down a lot, so even if you're only dealing like 5 damage, by turn 7, they probably have very low health. You also run a certain credit cheat cards in that deck, like Reichsbank, so, you might be able to Kriegsmarine earlier than that when they have larger hand sizes. So there's stuff you can do with Kriegsmarine. But yeah, it's pretty bad. Then we have Leopold. Everybody's favorite card. I've seen hundreds of different posts and comments on Discord and YouTube saying like, oh, they need to nerf Leopold, it's so broken. I think everybody who downloads the game for the first time, they play a couple hours, they start to get a grasp of the core mechanics of the game, and then they see Leopold, and they think, this is the best card in the game, surely. This card's just so powerful. A 6/4 artillery? Crazy. Deployment would send all enemy units off the board. It's an entire AoE board clear with a 6/4 artillery. And obviously, it is very good. However, once you have some more time in the game, once you put in a few more hours, once you've played against Leopold a dozen times or so, you start to realize that there's certain things you can do against it. One, it's not destroy all enemy units, it's send all enemy units to hand. So as long as you have the hand space to get them back, that's fine. And if you have units on board that have deployment effects, it means you get to do them again. So one of the things you can do against Leopold is just keep units on board that will be able to answer Leopold if they play it. Because Leopold doesn't have Blitz, and it's 10 credits, so it's the only thing they're doing on that turn most of the time. It means that, if you were able to immediately answer Leopold, then yes, it was a soft board reset, and you have to then spend all of your credits replaying all of the units that got returned to hand, but it's not like an immediate game-winning card. And dealing 4 damage, if you have a properly built deck, should not be difficult. Whether that's a 4-attack blitzer like a Hellcat, or just 4 damage order like a tactical strike or a hammer, you should realistically have a relatively easy way of killing Leopold. So it's largely just measured by the deployment effect, and the deployment effect is very, very strong. It's better against certain nations and worse against other nations. It's particularly good against Soviets, because a lot of Soviets is about slowly building up board control with huge expensive units that largely all have either passive or destruction effects. So, Germany... There was a period of time where German control just absolutely dominated Soviet control because of Leopold, King Tiger, and Comet, because also Soviets is probably one of the worst nations at dealing with Comet. So yeah, Germany is just like weirdly fitted to absolutely destroy Soviets. And Leopold is part of that, but it has seen a remarkable drop in play. It used to be that every single German deck would run Leopold, even the aggressive ones, as just like a turn 10 board reset, and some still do. But decks have gotten so efficient and so well built, and there's just more and more cards mean more and more efficient ways of answering Leopold, has made Leopold really drop off drastically in what decks run it, and it's now kind of like only control decks. And in control decks, obviously you're going to run Leopold, but like it's not a game winner that it used to be. You don't just play Leopold and say GG. You play Leopold to come back in the game and then win with other cards. So it's still going to be an A tier card, but you know, it's not an S tier card. How good is it? Honestly, it's probably lower down than From the Deep and Hipper, in my completely honest opinion. Just because also cards that cost a lot, you have to draw, like you have to realistically stay alive long enough to play them. And oftentimes, Germany probably struggles at surviving until turn 10 more than any other nation in the game. Or at least until 10 credits. So, you know, even if Leopold is very, very good, it's on its own in a vacuum. It's kind of hard to use. So yeah, got a low A tier. This might be a pretty spicy take. Lurking Danger, a 1 credit order, draw 2 random countermeasures. So 1 credit, draw 2 cards. Obviously, insanely good card. Just very, very efficient. The downside is it draws 2 countermeasures, and your opponent knows you have drawn 2 countermeasures, so they're going to be playing around it. And they're going to be playing around countermeasures until they have seen 2 of them. Now, that can be a good thing, because maybe you have countermeasures you're not holding up. They don't know what countermeasures they are, so, you know, sometimes it's good just sort of to get into your opponent's head by making them think of countermeasures and making them play worse. However, at like a top-level gameplay, people are realistically going to be able to play around countermeasures, and if it's an open deckless tournament, they're going to have a very specific knowledge as to what countermeasures you're playing. And even if not, even if you're just playing on ladder, if they're a good, like if you're a good player and they're a good player, they probably have a pretty good idea of what countermeasures is going to be. And it also requires you to run countermeasures, and in a draw 2 random countermeasures from your deck, means you probably want at least 5 countermeasures in your deck to be consistently making this 1 credit draw 2. Because, you know, if you have 4 countermeasures in your deck and then you draw 3 of them and then Lurking Danger is a 1 credit to draw 1 card, which is a lot worse. It is substantially worse, because you're also drawing a card that's kind of mediocre, because all countermeasures are kind of mediocre. So, you know, it's actually a very interestingly designed card, I would say. Like, at first glance, it looks very, very simple, but there's some depth behind it, and it makes some interesting deck building choices. But it's also just kind of like it's kind of just a difficult card to use, because it's hard to run countermeasures in every deck. Not every deck wants to run countermeasures. But we're gonna put it in high B tier just because it is just incredibly efficient card draw, and Germany lacks for card draw, generally speaking, which is one of the reasons why people run Lurking Danger, is just it lets you draw 2 cards out of your deck. Then we have Schwalbe. So actually, I think this was my suggestion. Schwalbe used to be terrible. I forget what it used to do. I think it like used to like, did it buff unit attacks? Or maybe it was destroy target enemy air unit that had like 5 or more attack. It used to be terrible. It used to be utterly unplayable. And then I had the grand old idea of suggesting maybe it should destroy all enemy air units. And I did not spend much time thinking about that suggestion. I just sort of threw it out there as, like, what's a way to make this absolutely terrible card potentially playable? And then that got put into the game. I don't know if it was because of my suggestion or not. And then for quite some time, you had Air being the best deck in the game, and then German Control being the best control deck in the game. And essentially, it was all about, can Germany draw Schwalbe by turn 9? Because if you play Schwalbe against Air, you probably win the game like 90% of the time. And then the issue is most other decks don't run any air units, so then Schwalbe just sort of becomes a 9-cost 7/5 fighter, which isn't terrible. But, you know, it just becomes a pretty bad, big, expensive card. So, how good is it? It's certainly below A tier. I would put it in B tier. Like, it is such a powerful effect that even if, like, you can't just simply look at the meta and say, oh, there's not a lot of air decks going around or something like that to say that this card is bad, because the effect is absolutely insane. But again, it's the 9 credits, and your opponent is going to be able to play around it. So, yeah, Schwalbe it's a good card. We'll maybe put it here. a bit between Lurking Danger and Fallschirmjäger, where it's a good card. But you know, it does require specific things to align. Not quite stars aligning, but you know, it does require specific decks to be being played. Then we have Hornisse, which is an absolutely hilarious card. And so Hornisse is a 7-credit 3/4 fighter. At the start of your turn, draw a card, deal damage to the enemy HQ equal to that card's cost. So this card has been gone for quite some time, and even when it was here, it was not played. But Hornisse was always very, very fun because you'd see your opponent play it on like turn 7. Sometimes they'd get it off of Africa Core, and it would just put the fear of God in you. Like, you see Hornisse touch the board, and you're like, I know realistically it draws them like 1 extra card and I take 1 damage because it drew them a Careless Talk. But like, you know, every player would have that one experience where their opponent slams a Hornisse and then you take 10 because they drew Leopold, which they then play, and you've just taken 10 HQ damage and your entire board's gone, and then you lose the game. Or like I have been hit by King Tiger. Like Hornisse hits King Tiger before. And that's a brutal feeling. But obviously it's a very bad card. 7 cost for a 4 health unit that doesn't do anything until the start of your next turn. And the thing that it does is draw a card and then deal between 1 and 10 damage to the opponent's HQ while giving them information on what the card you drew is a really, really terrible card. Like, this is a remarkably terrible card. I even tried making this work. I might have brought it to a tournament once. If I didn't, I think I convinced a Darkness to bring this to Worlds. Because we had an idea for just an ultra-heavy Germany deck, where you're just running all of the big units. Your idea is to beat up, like, sort of anti-aggro decks. And you just sort of threw Hornisse into the deck because you ran a lot of cards that say, like, you know, 10, and it would, like, 10 cost, 9 cost. And you would try to bait your opponent into playing a piece of removal on it. So I would probably put it on the high end of D tier. I think it's better than Blamin Vos. And just because there's a world where you can run a Hornisse, there is no world where you can run Blamin Vos. But it's a really bad card, and it's definitely worse than Kriegsmarine. Then we have Nakshub. And Nakshub is a card that has gone through many different iterations, and it was at one time probably the single best card in the game. It's not the single best card in the game now, but at the moment it's probably the single best of the 0-4 cards now that Pioneer Regiment has been nerfed. So what it does is a 1-cost 0-4 smokescreen. When you destroy the first unit on your turn, gain 2 credits. Essentially, I probably absolutely butchered the specific wording on that card, but essentially it means when you kill a unit on an enemy unit with either an order or with unit trading or with a deployment effect, you gain 2 credits for that turn, and it can only trigger once per turn. However, that is just good enough. If you play Nakshub and then you kill a unit on the same turn, you've already gained yourself a credit. So, you know, it's already gained a credit immediately, and if you are able to trigger Nakshub on, like, say, turn 2, you are doubling the number of credits you have access to on turn 2. You will have played 5 credits instead of 3 credits, and if you went first, you will have played 5 credits. You will have had 5 credits to your opponent's 1 credit. And then you also have it on the board to trigger every single successive turn and just absolutely snowball your opponent out because they play units to try to come back on board, and then playing units is simply giving you more fuel to the Nakshub, which then lets you get further and further ahead. So yeah, Nakshub, obviously S tier card. How broken is it? I think it's definitely less broken than Greif. It's probably less, like, I think it's here or here. It's better than autocannon for sure. Just because it's similar to autocannon in that if you play it, like, in the first 3 turns of the game, you probably win, like, 90% of the time. But unlike autocannon, it's harder for them to answer it. And also, it's probably slightly better. Well, autocannon is probably slightly better on average later in the game. So yeah, maybe that's why it's worse than Jägerbomber. Jägerbomber is just always fine, whereas there's a lot of situations where you draw Nakshub late in the game, especially in an aggressive deck, and it's just a completely dead draw. And that's actually the reason why it actually was cut in a lot of decks for a long time, is because people would look at it and say, like, well, if you draw it on turn 1 or 2, it might win you the game immediately, but if you draw it on, like, turn 6 or 7, you're going to lose the game immediately because you just completely skip your turn, because it's a useless card that does nothing. So yeah, we're going to put it there. Very powerful card. Then we have the Panzer 3L, I believe. Possibly the Panzer 3J. I think it's the L. It's a 3-cost, 3/5 blitz tank that has +1 attack for every other unit type on the board. So if you have an infantry, it's a 4/5 blitz tank. If you have an infantry and artillery, 5/5 blitz tank, etc. I'm sure a lot of people got very familiar with this card during the sort of the peak of the Blitz Doctrine meta, just because a lot of people would pick this as their small tank unit. Despite this having 2 operation cost, which is a big part of why this card is not particularly good. If this card had 1 operation cost, this card would be absolutely insane, but it has 2, and operation cost is really, really important. And also it's a tank, which means operation cost is even more important than on a unit like an artillery, or a fighter, or a bomber, where it can attack immediately. So this, you have to spend 4 credits to hit the opponent in the HQ, and then it costs 3 credits to play. So, it costs 7 credits to get something in the support line, and by putting in 7 credits, you probably want something better than a 3/5, possibly additional attack. So yeah, this is a weak card. It's not terrible. Obviously, you can play it in German tank decks. You can pick it off of developing effects. But it's very difficult to find a deck where you're super happy putting this in. It's probably best in a sort of more mid-rangey combined arms type of deck, where you can use it to deal 4 or 5 damage into the front line on turn 5 to try to kill stuff like Shermans or, Schützens or Winter Regiments, that kind of stuff. But it's still pretty bad. It's better than Fast Times, for sure. I think it's probably around the King Tiger in strength. I don't know, I think King Tiger is more likely to see play. So yeah, we'll put it here. Then we have the Panzerzug. 9 cost, 5 operation, 5/9 tank. So this is sort of the other train. There's obviously the armored train, the Soviet card, the 5 cost, 5 operation cost, 5/9. Those are the only 2 5 operation cost units in the game, and they have similar stat lines. They both have, it's a 3/7 to a 5/9. But the Panzerzug can actually attack. It also, when you play it, has a deployment effect of summoning 2 copies of the Panzer Grenadiers, the 2-cost 3/3 infantry that can move and attack on the same turn. So it's a 2-cost 3/3 infantry that behaves like a tank, and it gives them blitz. So for 12 credits, you can play Panzerzug, and then you can move and attack with one of the Panzer Grenadiers, and you can move the other Panzer Grenadiers. And it gives you 3 bodies on the board, a lot of defense, and a lot of HQ. That'd be like 11-15 worth of stats. And, that's pretty good. 9 credits for 11-15 worth of stats across 3 bodies. The downside is this is just a really big, dumb guy. And then once they kill the Panzer Grenadiers, this guy has 5 operation cost, which is just absolutely unplayable. This is just like, it's probably better than King Tiger now in its, be good against, anti-aggro, just play big dumb stuff. Just because it can do stuff immediately, it's more playable against aggro and mid-range decks. However, it's still really bad. So I'm going to just put it here above King Tiger. It's a card that, if you could pick this card off of Africa Core in certain matchups, you might pick it. But you never really want to put this card in your deck from the start of the game. Then we have Reich Research. So this is a very complicated one. I'm not going to get into all of its effects. But it was recently brought back with a buff, actually 2 buffs. The first buff is to the stage 2. This is that synthetic oil. So it now draws you an additional card on top of the 10 credits on the following turn. And a buff to the Urine Project, the tier 4 research. It now gives you a credit for each unit destroyed on top of destroy all enemy units. So, those are both 2 non-inconsequential effects. And tiers 1 and 3, obviously, were always very, very powerful and the ones everybody used. So, this card is absolutely insane. It's really, really good. Just the tier 1 research, which is 3 credits, destroy a unit that costs 3 or less, is pretty good. Even in just, mid-range decks, and to a certain extent aggressive decks. It's a bit harder to run in aggressive decks because there's not a ton of 3-cost units right now, compared to 2 costs, and you'd rather just play 7 strike if you're going to be destroying a unit that's 2 or less. However, in control decks and mid-range decks, the Vice Research is kind of an auto-include. This card is just absolutely nuts, and it is one of the best cards in Germany control. What makes the research so good is they're really, really good cards in basically every matchup, because it allows you to go super, super greedy on value, or allows you to be much more reactive earlier and cheaper if you need it against something more aggressive. So, Rice Research, I'm going to go put it up into S tier. This is a card that there should not really be another printed like this for Germany, because it is absolutely stupidly strong. I'm going to keep it under Nachschub, but it's certainly better than Autocannon, I think. Maybe by the end of this, I'll put Autocannon down into top of A. But, man, Autocannon's just so good. Ironically, Reich's Research actually answers Autocannon. One of the few answers to Autocannon. Then we have Ride of the Valkyries. So this is a 2-cost order. Give the enemy HQ. If this HQ takes damage, or takes 3 or more damage in a turn, give the enemy, as in yourself, an additional 2 credits. Or, I believe it's 2 credits. And this is, on the one hand, you might look at this and be like, look at Nachschub, and you're like, well, Nachschub is get 2 credits every turn when you trade out units, and it can be removed. This is a get 2 HQ, or 2 credits every time you deal 3 damage to the enemy HQ, and it's a permanent effect. However, dealing damage to the enemy HQ is not that easy. And if you're doing it, it probably means that you are in a situation where you have the support line, so it's harder to use those extra credits to continue pushing, tempo, because you don't want to flood the board and walk into an AoE. And also, it's absolutely useless if you're on, the defensive, because then you can't hit the enemy HQ. And if you are hitting the enemy HQ, it's because you were spending credits to hit the enemy HQ instead of spending credits trading out units. So yeah, Ride of the Valkyries, I've tried making it work so many times in so many decks. It probably gets its best value in the Germany-France mill, because that is a deck that wants as many extra credits as possible, and it's a deck that runs several cards, a plethora of cards that deal 3 damage exactly. So you're able to play those, get the credits back, and then spend your credits playing a Phony War or healing or trying to remove stuff or whatever. But that is one very specific deck that is bad. So Ride of the Valkyries is going to go down into D tier. Probably above. I think I'd put it above Hordise. I think it probably has the most potential. Honestly, to be completely fair, maybe it should go here, between Fast Times and Kriegsmarine, somewhere in this range. But to also keep this chart somewhat even, we're going to put it down here at the top of D tier. Then we have the Tiger 1E, or the Tiger IE, as I like to call it. This is sort of the original boogeyman of German control, where this used to be the big bad guy who would come down onto the board, and it's an 8-cost 7/7 heavy armor 2, cannot be targeted by orders. And orders used to be the main way you got rid of guys. So, when this guy came out, people would freak out and be like, oh no, you have to play 2 carpet bombs, and that's not enough to kill it. And heavy armor 2, it's so difficult to trade it out with units. And, it actually was a pretty big and scary unit for a while, but then it just got power crept out of the meta, because there just became more and more ways to remove it with deployment effects, or completely immobilize it with deployment effects. And yeah, it's just a unfortunate card. That, it's just so difficult to run. It really is just difficult to run, because the effect is still strong. Can't be targeted by orders is still a very powerful effect, and maybe an effect that people should look into, given the current US-France mill meta. But, yeah, it's just really hard to make work. So we're gonna have to put it down here in C tier. Honestly, probably worse than Panzer, because at least Panzer can do stuff immediately. Maybe better than King Tiger, just because if your opponent does have an answer, at least King Tiger is not as utterly devastating as King Tiger is. Obviously, King Tiger has a better highs but lower lows, I suppose. Then we have, we'll just move these guys over here. Then we have the Grenadiers. So these are 2 cards that came out together, I believe, in Brother in Arms. This is a 6-cost 6/6 Blitz infantry. 2 operation cost, I believe. And this is the better of the 2 Grenadier guards. Or not guards, just the better of the 2 Grenadiers. Now, obviously, it's still really bad, so we're going to put it down here. But honestly, it's probably better than Panzer. Whoops. And then we have the second Panzer Grenadier, or the second Grenadier, which is a 6-cost 6/6 Fury infantry. Now, the benefit is if you have both of these on the board, they become veteran, or if you can trigger their veteran with another effect, then they each have different effects. I forget what the 2 effects are, but given the primary way of getting them to be veteran is having both of them on the board at once. The veteran effect of one of them, I believe, is deal like 5 damage to the enemy HQ, or 4 damage, something like that. And the other one is give all enemy units -2/-2, or -2 health, or something like that. So essentially one of them is an AoE and the other one's burn. And if you get both of them on the board, it makes it really difficult for your opponent to remove them, because one is AoE, one of them's burn, and they also keep their Blitz and Fury effects. But obviously, I have seen somebody get both of these on the board at the same time, once, maybe twice. And no, I think I've seen it 3 times, and the first 2 times I just killed them on the following turn, and the 3rd time I was dead on board no matter what they played. So yeah, obviously they're really bad cards. This one is much worse because you can't really run it on its own. That being said, it's probably better than everything else, just because a 6-cost 6/6 Fury is a better stat line than, say, Hornisse. Whereas a 6-cost 6/6 Blitz is actually, somewhat usable, to be completely honest. So, we'll put this one up in here, and we'll leave the other Grenadier guy down here. I can't be bothered to remember the names. I think they're 39 and 119 or something like that. And we have this guy, which, to be completely honest, I also forget his name, but he came out in the most recent expansion. And essentially this guy is a 2-cost 4/4 infantry. I believe he's a Panzer Grenadier of some sort, but maybe just a straight infantry regiment. Yeah, I think he is an infantry regiment. And he's a 2-cost 4/4 Blitz infantry, which sounds like it's really, really good. 1 operation cost. And it has the written text, when you deploy another unit, destroy this unit. So, essentially, this works in a lot of different ways. Either you run this in a deck with a lot of orders and countermeasures, so you're not playing a lot of other units, or you play this as your sort of a card in a control deck or something like a ramp deck, where you want to get this out on turn 3, and then you're just doing other stuff. You're playing orders, doing other things, for the first few turns, and then you start slamming stuff down on turn 5 after this guy's been traded out. Or you just play him later in the game, to immediately 3 credits, 4 damage to the front line. Or you play him at the end of your turn, so you play units, and then with 3 credits remaining, you play this guy, push him to the front line, and then at the start of your following turn, you trade him out, and then play other units. Or you can situationally play him in an aggro deck. It's much harder to use him in an aggro deck, I will say. But it also fits pretty well into mid-range decks in the similar fashion as the control deck, in that you play him at the end of your turn in the mid-game, and then try to trade him off or hit face with him at the start of your following turn. So he's just a pretty good guy. I quite like this card. I would put him here. I think it's much better than the Panzer, or the Fallschirmjägers. But, he's not an A-tier card by any means. It's just a very solid card. Then we have Dornier. And this Dornier is very, very fun. This is another elite from the newest expansion. And I really love this card. So it's a 3-cost 2/5 fighter, which on its own is actually pretty good. I don't understand why the Blamin Vos can't be a 2/5 if this could be a 2/5. They're both 3 cost. But 3 cost, 2 up, 2/5 fighter, so it's pretty difficult for the opponent to remove. And it has the text, units you deploy move immediately into the front line if possible. And this is amazing. Because if you're playing units without blitz, it just immediately puts it into the front line. So it essentially gives it blitz, particularly if it's an infantry, because that's going to buy you an entire extra turn as well as the credits that it would cost to operate it. And then there's certain effects or certain cards that, you might not want to push to the front line. Things like blitz fighters or blitz bombers. I've seen somebody have a Dornier on board and then lost the game because they couldn't kill me with Comet, because every time they played Comet, it would be immediately moved to the front line. And then there's things like Naxtrube, obviously, where you'll push the 0/4 Naxtrube to the front line, which sometimes is a good thing, sometimes is a bad thing. So it's a card that's not just like... It requires some thought to use, but it's a very, very powerful effect. It's also a good fighter body for something like a Combined Arms type effect. And it can be run in a wide variety of decks, because obviously you want it in an aggressive deck to flood a bunch of stuff to the front line. But it's also playable in like a mid-range or a control deck, because you run bigger units, so immediately getting your bigger units to the front line is a good way to clog up the front line from the opponent. It's just a really, really powerful card, really, really fun card, and I think this is an A-tier card. Not as like dominant as Leopold, but I think that this is a very powerful card, and a lot of people have been underrating just how good this card is. Next, we have the Panther D, also a card from Winter War. I guess this card is 2 expansions old now. I'm not a fan of this card in terms of its design. I particularly don't like this design. So what it is, it's a 7 cost, 3 operation, 7/6 tank, heavy armor 1. When this unit attacks, also deal attack damage to the enemy HQ. And this is an overflow damage. This is also deal the attack damage. So if you attack the enemy HQ for 7, it will deal an additional 7 damage. If you attack a unit for 7, it will also deal 7 damage to the enemy HQ. And if you can get its attack up to 10, like say playing Bolster, and then you attack the enemy HQ, it will one-shot the opponent. Now, obviously, the downside is you're playing 7 for a 6 health unit that is not invulnerable to orders or deployment effect, and your opponent might just immediately kill it with a hammer. But obviously, during Blitz Doctrine meta, we saw a lot of Panther Ds win a lot of games because he would develop into a Panther D and it would come down as an 8/7 or possibly a 9/8. And your opponent would have dumped a lot of removing other stuff, and then you just simply kill your opponent in 1 or 2 turns with this card. It's a very, very polarizing card. I don't like just removal check cards, where it's just like they play it, and if you can remove it, they immediately lose from the massive tempo loss. And if they play it and you can't remove it, they immediately win because it's just a stupidly powerful effect on a body that is relatively easy to deal with and doesn't require any like deck building restrictions to put it in your deck. So my personal opinions on the card design aside, it's not A or S tier because it's simply really easy to remove if your opponent is playing a deck, a good deck. On the other hand, it's better than C tier, I think, or at least on the top end of C tier, just because it is a powerful effect. It is an effect that, if your opponent can't remove it, it is much, much better than, say, the Tiger IE or even the King Tiger. It will end the game much faster, it will put your opponent under much more pressure, and it also costs less than the Tiger IE, the Panzer Zug, or the King Tiger, so it's also less of a tempo loss if your opponent does have an answer to it. So yeah, I think the Panther D is sort of the best of the just big dumb tanks that Germany has access to. So we're going to put it here at the very bottom of B tier. Part of that is also at C tier is getting very big. But yeah, it's worse than Africa Corps, I think. But yeah, as you can see, the cards that have been rotated out, the units that have been rotated out, like Jägerbomb, and then the units that have been added to the game in the last like 3 expansions, like the 2 Grenadier Guards, the Panther D, the even Dornier is kind of awkward to get off of an Africa Corps. It really shows how awkward Africa Corps has gotten recently. Then we have Alpenfestung, and I love this card. I got to reveal this card, I believe, if I remember correctly. It's a 7 cost order, set your HQ defense to 25, remove the top 10 cards of your deck. So this is essentially Germany's only healing card. It's technically not healing because it's setting your HQ defense to 25, not gaining 5 or 25 HQ defense. But it's essentially the only way that Germany has to increase its HQ defense. So that's really big. It's also situationally really powerful because obviously if you're at 1 HQ defense and you play this, you heal 24, and 7 cost heal 24 is pretty good. But, you know, if you're at like 20 health, your opponent's never damaged you, and they're setting up like a push OTK, it's gonna feel pretty bad to play Alpenfestung to heal 5. Because it also removes the top 10 cards of your deck. And if you're in any type of control match that likely is going to go to fatigue, playing Alpenfestung will immediately lose the game. Because, you know, you can't really come back from 10 fatigue. Now, if you play this in fatigue, that's a different question, because you can't remove 10 cards of your deck if your deck is empty. So that can be pretty fun, is if you're in fatigue, you can play Alpenfestung to set your HQ defense back to 25, to draw a few more fatigue draws, and that might be the difference between winning or losing the game. But its most important effect is making German control. You sort of run this as a get out of jail free card against aggro. Now, the big downside of this card is you need to be able to deal with the board on the following turn. Because how this is going to work is you're getting low on health, your opponent's flooding the board, they're dealing a bunch of aggro damage to you. And then, you know, you get down to the point where you're worried your opponent is going to one-shot you, so you play Alpenfestung, but that's your entire turn. So all the units on board that have dealt the damage to you are still there, and then will deal the damage to you again. And if you're afraid of a card like Blitzkrieg, what's going to happen is they bring you down to 12, and you're worried about Blitzkrieg, so you play Alpenfestung to go to 25, and then with their free extra turn, they're going to flood the board with Blitz units and then kill you with Blitzkrieg anyways. So it can be difficult to use, but I think its effect is worth it. In certain matchups, in certain decks. So I think it's similar to Envelop in a lot of ways, where it's like, there's a world where you can run Alpenfestung. But there's also there's a big world where it's not going to be that good. Then we have Stuka. And Stuka's a very fun card. It's a 4-cost, 3/2 Blitz Bomber, 2 operation cost. With the text, it becomes veteran when you destroy an enemy ground unit. Yeah, it becomes veteran when you destroy an enemy ground unit with any effect. It can be with an order. And then its veteran version is whenever you attack and destroy an enemy ground unit with any of your units, so it has to be through unit trading, the enemy discards a card. So essentially, you're able to theoretically discard your entire opponent's hand if they have 9 units on board, and you are able to attack into those 9 units with your own units while having a veteran Stuka on board. You can make them discard 9 cards. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen, but there is ways to set up Stuka to discard, say, 2 cards in a single turn. And discarding 2 cards from your opponent while removing stuff with a Blitz Bomber, while keeping that Blitz Bomber on board that is both threatening to remove more units and to discard more cards in the future, is a pretty good trade-off. Now, there's also a lot of situations where Stuka will not discard any cards and then immediately die and just be a pretty subpar, like, a worse, there's like a 3-cost, 3/3 Blitz Bomber that Germany has access to. It would just be a worse one of those, I suppose, but it's a card that I think merits a decent amount of, a decent amount of thought. I would not put it into A tier, but I think it's solidly in B tier. I think it's probably between Schwalbe and the Infantry Regiment. So I'd put it right here. I know a lot of people think this card is really bad. I've played a lot of this card. I've played against a lot of this card. I think it's decent. I think it's decent, and I think there is room for it to get better in the future. But yeah, it's certainly not anything special. It came out in Brothers in Arms. And then last but not least, we have Shifting Attack. This is another card from the most recent expansion. And this card is going straight into A tier for me. This card is amazing. It's a 2-credit order. Send a friendly unit to its owner's hand. It costs 0 to deploy. So essentially, it lets you re-trigger a deployment effect. It lets you heal a unit for free. It lets you attack again with a blitz unit. It's incredibly useful in a wide range of situations, and at 2 credits, it has a very, very low sort of tempo loss. Like the opportunity cost of this card is very, very low in terms of the credits. So you don't have to like dump. It's not like this card easily could have been like 4 credits, 5 credits, and it would have been a lot worse at that. But at 2, you can do a couple things. You can do, for example, Leopold shifting attack on the same turn to get Leopold back in hand. Now it only costs 0 until the end of your turn, so it won't stay 0 cost in your hand forever. But you will be able to play it again. A very common use is playing this on the Panzer Grenadiers to get back, like the give 35D combined arms Panzer Grenadiers to get a second 35D in combined arms. Or another common use of it is on Comet to do Comet attack phase, shifting attack, Comet attack phase. You can also do it on something like a Jagdbomber, something like a Schwalbe. It's just a very, very powerful card that really you can just sort of throw into your deck, and you can throw this into most decks, and you will get value out of it most of the time. It's very difficult for this card to do absolutely nothing. And even sometimes it will just simply play like a blitz unit, attack into a unit, shifting attack it back to your hand, replay it for free, and then attack again, and it's been healed back to full health, and it gets to attack a second time. It's just a very, very powerful card. Now, where in A tier am I going to put it? It's very hard to say. Like, is it a better card than Leopold? Is it a better card than Hipper? I think it's safe to put it here between Hipper and Leopold. So that is it for this video. This is my German elites tier list. Let me know if you think I'm crazy, if I'm an idiot. If you disagree with me on anything, put those comments in the description, or put those comments in under this video, or join my Discord and you can give your comments there. We can have a full-on discussion. And once again, this is not a crafting list. This is just my personal thoughts on the power level of all of these cards. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. This is just my opinion. Let me know yours, and I will catch you in the next video, coming pretty shortly, because I'm coming back to Cards, back to YouTube, and I have a few ideas of what I want to do next. So thank you very much for watching, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one.